Columbia, Akshya Saxena, who is assistant professor of English at Vanderbilt University, and Preeti Singh, who is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages program at Dartmouth. I should tell you right now that meeting is being recorded, which I think you probably already see in front of you. So if we encourage you to participate in the conversation when we open up to Q&A, but you're also welcome to anonymize yourself, keep your camera off, keep your mic off. But though we were looking forward to hearing your comments as well, so we hope that you will join as you see fit. This discussion, this roundtable, is part of a longer series that's kind of informally called Empire and Its Afterlives, which is under the Center for the Study of Globalization and Cultures, which was set up. This center was set up in 1999 under the joint directorship of Professor Akbar Abbas and Benjamin Lee, and it's an interdisciplinary center based in the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Hong Kong. The focus of our work in the center is on issues of culture and globalization, with special reference to Asia, China, and Hong Kong. Major research themes include, but are not limited to, the cultures of capitalism, global flows of culture, media, and technology, cities and globalization, new communities, publics, and identities, as well as postcolonial theory and neoliberalism, and all of its many forms. It is now currently under the joint directorship of myself and my outstanding colleague, Dr. Alvin Wong. And what we've done over the past year is have a series of conversations that are kind of wide-ranging. This is kind of ending the year, and this and a film screening next week, which I would encourage you to come to. The format, I will kind of briefly, before we start it, I will give you a warning that it's so you can have some kind of a roadmap over the next hour and a half. The plan for the evening is as follows. Each one of the four of us will give a sort of statement about the sort of statement about the discipline or the method or the thing, which is postcolonial studies. Then Preeti Singh will give a kind of an account of what we have just rambled, but in coherent form, and then we'll open it up to another round of discussion about the kind of methodologies or the potential methodologies or the proposed methodologies and projects that might be heralded under the rubric of postcolonial studies. And then at that point, I will invite, I hope that you will join us in conversation about this project. This is very much a conversation as the four of us are figuring out what the status of this thing, this unwieldy thing called postcolonial studies is. And so I look forward to hearing, I look forward to the conversation. I'm really excited about it, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Preeti Singh, who will kick things off.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And thanks, Daniel and Georgina, for all your organizational work on this event. And thank you all, Akshya and Isabel, for inviting me to be an interlocutor. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation today. And that we have titled, What Should the Method of Postcolonial Studies Be? So I want to begin by extending the title of our conversation to what should the method of postcolonial studies be in our current political conjuncture? After all, postcolonial studies as a discipline emerged in the 1970s and 80s as a response to the concerns of that time, a conjuncture marked by a series of crises precipitated by the entanglement of the Cold War with the processes of decolonization in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In the wake of these crises and the political ferment of the 1960s, the decades that followed were marked by a collective sense of often disillusionment and a turn to the right, as Stuart Hall so markedly points out in his analysis of Thatcherist Britain. Much like anti-colonialism, whose affects, arguments, and ways of address were constituted by its aspirations towards political sovereignty, the vision of postcolonial studies in the 70s and 80s responded to the fate of those aspirations. And here, when I use the phrase postcolonial studies, I'm thinking together about the intersection of disciplines, theory, and history, and how they might differently inform our respective approaches to the field. Today, as we work towards conceptualizing the method of postcolonial studies, I want us to think about how we may reimagine the field in the light of the challenges of our historical present. Or as Caribbean scholar David Scott so eloquently puts it, what does our cognitive political present demand of a practice of postcolonial criticism? In my own research on the cultural lives of the national emergency in India in the 1970s, I think a lot about this time that we are living in, a time of undeclared emergency in India and maybe even the world, even as we continue to memorialize and discursivize the post-colonial crisis of the 1970s towards what could be called competing political ends. Our historical present is witness to the rise of far-right nationalisms that threaten to push us deeper and deeper into provincial politics, alongside a migrant crisis that tests daily the limits of our epistemologies and ethics. And yet, as we very well know, our present is not quarantined from the past, and I'm using Syed's formulation here, as we find ourselves living in the continued afterlives of the crisis of late 20th century, or to use Benjamin's phrase here, as they flash up before us in a moment of danger. How may we rethink post-colonial studies as a field to respond to the political, not just representational concerns of our times, especially the urgency of transnational solidarity and connections? How may we learn as post-colonial critics from the activism and epistemologies of those who are at the front lines of this present onslaught? And how may we recuperate, break from, or even reimagine the missed opportunities in the field to conceptualize a future, not just the past, beyond our present epistemological and political impasse? All our speakers today grapple with these questions in their respective books, whether it's conceptualizing an anti-colonial and anti-authoritarian theory of reading, as Daniel's book does, or going beyond reading to imagine language as it is lived in the world, as Akshya's book does, or reading media as a site for transnational connection and solidarity. As post-colonial critics, we are all grappling with what it means to imagine a world, a language, a progressive space of connection vis-a-vis post-colonial studies. With that, let's hear from Akshya about her book and its evocation of post-colonial method.
Thank you so much, Preeti. That was so inspiring to hear. Hi, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Daniel and Georgina for organizing this event, and by thanking all of you for coming today. I'm quite excited to be a part of this conversation because years ago, Daniel, Isabel, and I, when we were newly minted PhDs, we all read each other's drafts of what have become our new first books. And Preeti has been a recent interlocutor. So really, it's an honor to be here and to be read and discussed by all of them. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I'll introduce my first book, Vernacular English, Reading the Anglophone in Post-Colonial India, to reflect specifically on its method in relation to post-colonial studies as a field and the historical present, as Preeti has invited us to do. Before I do that, I thought I'd drop a link to my book only so that you have a reference for it when I'm talking about it. Okay. So vernacular English is a comparative study in scholarly terms and academic terms. It's a comparative study of 20th and 21st century English literature in India after the country became independent in 1947. So one of the big interventions of my book is that it examines English as part of India's multilingual local milieu and tells its story as a language that's variously claimed by people across caste, class, and racial divides. Inheritor of generations of post-colonial scholarship, I found myself writing in the face of deeply felt debates about vernacular and global languages in India. But as I continued, it became clear that despite the pervasive and much bemoaned presence of English, as post-colonial scholars, we had often failed to read it. Thus, as for others here, the question of method is really at the heart of my book. And as Isabel writes in her, in some ways, it's also the argument. So my argument is that the unmarked neutrality of English as a scholarly medium, as well as its much remarked upon expropriations as a global imperialist language, both perpetuate the absorptive logic of English, as Isabel reminded us yesterday in a conversation, is a tool of white supremacy. But in contrast to dominant paradigms of post-colonial studies, which view English as either indexing oppressive British colonial power or contesting it, I show how English is leveraged both by the post-colonial Indian state and those who it oppresses. So taking a long historical view, which in my case means bringing the story forward and recognizing the impact of both the colonial past and post-independent state policies, I foreground the overlooked history of the legislation of English as an associate official language of India. In a move that was both a continuation of colonial governmentality, but also an attempt to break from it, English and Hindi were both legislated and continue to be the official languages of India. So vernacular English shows how the sign of a colonial/global English makes invisible the relations between English and other languages, like Hindi in this case, relations that strengthen a Hindu nationalist version of the Indian state, as well as enable its contestations. I named these relations between the multilingual literary and media cultures and the hegemony of a metropolitan literary English that threatens to subsume it by framing English as a vernacular, by shrinking the scale of analysis and pursuing three interlocking lines of inquiry. One, how does the English language live in other languages and media like Hindi literature, bilingual bureaucratic documents, Bollywood films, and multilingual protest cultures, such that the boundaries between what is English and what is another language are almost always blurred? Two, how do these instances of translation and transmediation make the English language a contested site of caste, class, ethnic, and racial formation in India? And three, how must we, as scholars of comparative and post-colonial literature, read the text that we do in the shadow of this vernacular life of English? So vernacular English grew out of debates in post-colonial studies, especially conversations in language, translation, colonialism, and comparison, where I found that language always meant other languages, not English, and colonialism always meant British rule. But as I completed the book, I realized that it's also a deeply personal project. And by that, I don't mean that the book is about me, but that it was shaped by my experience as a student of English literature in India, where I noticed a difference in how we discussed English in the college classroom and how we lived the language outside of it. So I'm talking about the early 2000s in India. This is the time of call centers, Hindu nationalism, as well as the heyday of post-colonial studies. The dominance of the category of the nation in Anglo-centric post-colonial studies meant that we, as budding post-colonial critics, did not sufficiently acknowledge how English allowed contestations of the nation, or considered the politics of English outside of literary texts. Inside the classroom, we discussed English as a colonial language with a violent legacy and role in transnational capitalism, all of which is true, of course, but outside, and this is sort of the origin story of the book, I would see my grandmother, who didn't know a word of English, read English words in the Hindi newspaper that we got at home at the time. Words describing trends in fashion and food were often transliterated in English, so they were written out in the Nagari script of Hindi, and observing her read English made me wonder about the limits of a language. When did Hindi become English or vice versa? And how did this translation enable a certain kind of Hindi-speaking gendered subject? So that's where this project began. But it grew into this bigger work about what we think of when we think about English. What becomes intelligible as the English language in the world? And how does English itself become intelligible? My motivation writing this book was to convey the different ways that English as a language lives and moves in the world today. Because on the one hand, the circulation, presence, and authority of a language like English are not only literary, but also visual and sonic. English is seen on billboards, clothing, and storefronts. It is heard in political slogans, telemarketing calls, classes in spoken English, and Bollywood films. On the other hand, we also know that statistically, only about 10% of India's population is fluent in English or considers it its mother tongue. Of the approximately 1.3 billion people in India today, only about 125 million speak English. Most people report English as their second language, which is accessed through formal institutions of education contingent upon one's caste, class, and gender privilege. Thus, every day, the English language accrues and exerts meanings beyond conditions of formal literacy. So the question for me was, how do those who do not know the English language nevertheless still experience it? And reading English as an Indian vernacular language and amid the so-called vernacular languages flips the analytical gaze and allows me to ask that question. Postcolonial literary scholars have largely focused on English through sites where it serves to access a global market, whether that's in call centers or elite literary production. I focus on individuals in India who face the global dominance of English in their everyday lives, but cannot read or speak it. I study Indian English literature in relation to sites where English is divorced from its script and colonial sensibility, like in accented speech, in Hindi transliterations, linguistic hybrids, and in the writings and activism of caste-oppressed people who are imagined to be the linguistic and political others of English. By analyzing embodied acts of listening, of remembering, and speaking in localized frameworks of intelligibility, I argue that how a language is used can defy its colonial or elite logic and contradict what it is institutionally, conventionally supposed to represent. In postcolonial literary studies, vernacular can refer to a language, a style, or knowledge associated with something common, native, local, non-dominant, or even indigenous. Scholars turn to vernacular languages and styles to challenge the broad homogenizing frameworks of global and national analysis. In studies of modern India, the vernacular is a term rarely used to describe English. So framing English as a vernacular is my deliberate attempt to, one, name the shifting language politics in India. Two, to jolt out readers out of a long-standing complacency about English as an exclusively British colonial language. And three, to trouble the neat divisions between local and global, between colonial and post-colonial, and monolingual and multilingual, all of which subtend comparative work quite critically. To suggest that English can be a language of the people challenges powerful dynamics undergirding India's gendered, caste-marked, and classed linguistic and literary landscape. I show that the story of a colonial language like English is also the story of the presumed native languages like Hindi, and that claiming a language as a vernacular is always as much a political assertion as it is an acknowledgement of an embattled position. Thus, in India, anti-colonial linguistic commitments to national vernaculars like Hindi can sometimes be complicit with conservative and right-wing politics. Post-colonial scholarly association of vernacular only with the native or the powerless misses how vernacular languages and knowledges can support oppressive caste discrimination and religious and ethno-nationalist fascism as much as they can advance anti-caste resistance. So I'm bringing this to a conclusion by just sort of gesturing outside towards the field. The question of language in all its forms has always been critical for scholars in post-colonial studies. Knowledge of other languages and of language as such is foundational to challenging colonial projects. As Julietta Singh writes in Unthinking Mastery, across 20th century anti-colonial discourses, language repeatedly emerged as one of the most vital problems in the production and articulation of decolonized subjectivities. But the intellectual authority of literary and area studies, its credibility and viability, she writes, continuously relied on mastery as its target, as that which would produce authoritative, legitimate knowledge, and in so doing, resist the power of Eurocentrism. By turning attention to mediations of languages and conditions of reading, of knowing and unknowing, much like Daniel does, I trace a different post-colonial method. By asking how we know what we know, I hope we can name the colonial power structures, the different kinds of colonial power structures associated with English, without reinscribing them each time we discuss the language. So when I say that English is a vernacular or should be read as a vernacular, I want us to pay attention to the racialization of English through its embodied and material mediations. I want us to acknowledge the very real political and multivalent desire to make common that animates English as eminently translatable and eminently global. Thank you.
I think Daniel is next. Yes.
That was fantastic. Actually, that was really helpful and clarifying a lot of things and thinking with you. I have a different way of getting at the question, and so my book is the World Literature for the Wretched of the Earth, and it is a study of 4 anti-colonial thinkers from South Asia who were writing against British rule and trying to imagine a world after colonialism, after empire. And that is then bracketed a book ended in some ways by a pairing of Eric Auerbach, one of the early founders of comparative literature, and Frantz Fanon, the famous Martinician with African anti-colonial thinker. And so the book is already sort of a mess in some sense, and it's that mess which I think is one of the ways that I've been trying to think about the method of postcolonial studies. As we've built up to this, it clarified one thing about my commitment to post-colonial studies over and above other names that we might give the field. And it's, for me, post-colonial names names or identifies an inheritance. In other words, post-colonial theory or post-colonial studies is the benefactor of anti-colonial thought, even if the promissory note has been somewhat mishandled. And that is that's a very standard line at this point, which in some ways, perhaps we can maybe talk about this more in the discussion, would differentiate, at least in the first instance, post-colonial theory from decolonial thought as having this kind of inheritance or a genealogy. But my definition of anti-colonial thought, my definition of post-colonial thought is as follows, and therefore it becomes messy. Post-colonial thought post-colonial theory, post-colonial studies is not the study of a world that we exist in. It is not a study of the world after colonialism, because as we know, the world after colonialism is still a colonial world. The colonial world that Western Europe brought into existence, forced others to bring into existence on their backs, is the one that did not fade away with the great decolonial wave in the mid-20th century. And so, in other words, the post-colonial, the idea of post-colonial thought is actually to imagine and to act upon or act on the behalf of a future utopia, which we, while desiring that for ourselves, a future utopia after colonialism, without a world without colonialism. That while we desire that, while we act on behalf of that world, we fundamentally know that that world will, if it will ever exist, will certainly exist well beyond our lifetimes. And so it is it's a vision for utopia, which is so far past colonialism that it is past our lives. Our lives will end before colonialism does, and therefore that is what shapes a sort of kind of what I would call a realist notion of post-colonial thought. In that sense, the difference between anti-colonial thought and post-colonial thought is not that substantial. Anti-colonial thinkers were trying also to imagine a world beyond and after colonialism, trying to imagine and create the contours for a world without colonialism, without imperialism. And the figures that I study, so Gandhi, Ambedkar, Bhagat Singh, and Lala Hardayal, as well as Frantz Fanon, were very mumuch kind of foregrounded the acceptance of the impossibility of this world within their lifetimes. Certainly, Hardayal and Bhagat Singh died well before Indian independence. Gandhi and Ambedkar lived to see India and Pakistan gain independence, but were horribly were disappointed to see what it looked like, and continued to fight for a truly post-colonial world, even though they knew that they were going to die before they would see that realized. So on one hand, there's a certain type of messiness at the beginning. So there's if post-colonial theory, postcolonial studies is the benefactor of anti-colonial thought. That gives us a genealogy, but if anti-colonial thought and postcolonial thought have the same mission of imagining a world which we should act on behalf of, but which we should acknowledge from the outset we will not live to see, they actually share much more. They're contemporaneous in a kind of philosophical way, rather than a kind of genealogical tracking into the 20th century. The title of my book is another way of thinking about method of postcolonial thought, and it is the first half of it is obvious. So world literature is indebted to Eric Auerbach. Wretched of the Earth is indebted to Frantz Fanon. The subtitle is Anti-Colonial Aesthetics, Postcolonial Politics. And in some ways, what that does is it signals, it mirrors the title, right? So the world literature becomes anti-colonial aesthetics, Wretched of the Earth becomes postcolonial politics. But I mean, what's at stake there if those things are not in a kind of clear trajectory, but rather contemporaneous with each other? That is, I think, the problem that I am still wrestling with. And so I think trying to think of the relationship between postcolonial studies, postcolonial thought, and anti-colonial theory as both separate, kind of genealogical related, as well as synonymous, is the kind of is where I'm now moving to in a way. The book is also indebted very much, as it's clear, to comparative literature, and I've been trying to think about why I was so insistent on this relationship between comparative literature or comparative philology and anti-colonial thought or postcolonial theory. And I think it's because I was really influenced by a French historian, Marcel Detienne, who argued for the he argued against the seemingly obvious existence of comparison. So in other words, he was interested in the study of time periods in history, and his argument was that any one time period is not actually fully autonomous from another. That those time periods always blend together. And the critic, the historical critic, the literary critic, also is not autonomous. We are quite porous as our subjects. Our subjectivity is quite porous. And so as we define ourselves as critics, and also as we define our time periods as autonomous, we are doing a lot of intellectual work that we then mask by declaring those things to be self-evident. Marcel Detienne asks us to then return to these sites as infinitely porous in order to foreground the intellectual labor, but also the political labor of creating the grounds for comparison. So once you tentatively decide that contemporary literature is from 1945 to now, as most English departments have done, what you've done is you've created a kind of tentative autonomy for a period, which you can bracket it off, and in so doing, you yourself form your own kind of tentative subjectivity as a critic, but one which remains open and infinitely invitational. It's a very French book. But then the next step is actually the radical one, or it has the potential to be the radical one, which is to say, by asserting that the contemporary literature can be compared to Victorian literature, what one is doing is, in this kind of boring instance, is asserting not simply cohesion of each of them, but also that there were grounds for comparison. And the implicit claim around the grounds for comparison is that there are grounds of equivalence. In other words, that in order to compare something, they must actually have more in common than they differ. And then they must have a ground. They must have kind of there's kind of a founding claim that Chen claims for equality that's rendered implicit by the comparativist method. And so on one hand, this can be sort of bland, and we can compare Victorian literature to contemporary literature. On the other, I think it can really form it can really gesture towards the possibility of affiliation. So to think about politics across time and across space, to think about modes of political community that aren't bound by their time period or their geographical location, but rather can think analogously with other struggles around the world. And so I mean, that the comparativist method is indebted. I mean, I think that is not simply contemporaneous with the emergence of anti-colonial thought, but actually shares a really common vision with anti-colonial thought about imagining a world that could and must be otherwise. Which leads me to I guess admit a thing that I've realized after the fact of having written the book, which is that one of my concerns, which is deeply personal, and it was about learning about my uncle, who was a German professor in the 1980s. He was gay. He died from HIV/AIDS in 1993, and he left academia in the late 80s to become to declare himself the wine ambassador of West Germany, and in so doing declared that the pleasures of life in the moment can act on behalf of a future world that he at that point knew he was not going to live to see. And so AIDS activism is another moment when we can imagine, and my uncle imagined, acting on behalf of a world, drinking wine with friends, that takes care of friends in the meantime. We know that we want, and so to advocate for both drinking wine with friends and also medication that would stall the effects of HIV/AIDS is to do the same thing that anti-colonial thought is thinking about, which is to act on behalf of a world that we must demand to exist, but to make sure that we have not ignored our friends in the meantime, because all of our lives will end before that utopia is realized. So in other words, if dead gay uncles or gunkles are the sort of secret project of the book, I think that the comparativist method allows us not simply to think across space, to not think about analogous political movements. Bhagat Singh in the HRSA was interested in the Irish Republican Army, for example, and thinking analogously with the Irish struggle and the Indian struggle, but also I think thinking across time, and so thinking about the importance of various different forms of political engagement in all of their iterations, and thinking about how those might share grounds for comparison, and grounds therefore of equivalence, and therefore hopefully grounds of equality. I think I'll stop there. I have a few more thoughts, but they're about nationalism, and that's boring. So I'll hand it over to Isabel.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. Again, a big thank you to Georgina and to Daniel for inviting me and for putting this together. And it really is a pleasure to think about all these issues with all of you, particularly since I felt that the books grew up together, right? In some way, they did. The projects grew up together in some way. So I wanted to start by saying that I'm coming from a slightly different perspective, or I would say, or more disciplinary focus than the past two works. I was trained in the history department, and my research engaged sound studies and media studies. And yet I think that it was grappling with many of the same issues. So I'm going to follow a very similar format to Aksha's, which is begin with just a very, very brief description of what the book is and the main arguments, and then I move to the questions of postcolonial studies and how is it that I address them or not address them. So give me just 1 second. Make sure I have. So my book, the book Radio for the Millions, Hindi Urdu Broadcasting Across Borders, which the link should be on the chat if you want to sort of just be able to see it, is what I consider a transnational history of radio broadcasting, specifically in Hindi and Urdu, from the late colonial period in South Asia, of course, through the early post-independence era. So from about 1920 to early 1980s. The book brings together two fields that have been very rarely in conversation. So first is the rich and growing literature of sound studies, and particularly works on radio. And second is 20th century South Asian history, specifically works on the end of the empire, the anti-colonial movement, World War II, and the 1947 independence and subsequent partition of India. And now the study, very much like Aksha's own study, is organized around language. And as I'm sure most of the audience would know, Hindi and Urdu are North Indian languages with over 500 million speakers throughout South Asia. And they share the same grammar and vocabulary of colloquial speech, but they're written in different scripts. And they have developed very distinct literary traditions. And during the communal tensions that ultimately culminated in the 1947 partition of India into independent India and Pakistan, Hindi became increasingly associated with Hindu communities and Urdu with Muslim communities, and as well as with the state and in important ways that we can discuss. Now, the book analyzes a number of radio stations that broadcast in Hindi and Urdu or anything in between, including the well-known national stations, All India Radio in pre- and post-partition, Radio Pakistan, the BBC Hindustani services, as well as locations outside of the Indian subcontinent, as well as stations outside of the Indian subcontinent that aim their services at South Asian populations. Now, the book consists of 3 parts, and each part focuses on a particular moment, a historical moment that becomes important, but really in a moment where what radio is was deeply debated, and also focuses on a particular genre of radio that becomes important to those debates. So it looks at World War II and the role of radio news in the first section of the book, and has 2 chapters doing that. It looks at music during what I call the post-independence decade in India and Pakistan, and it looks at the role of both classical music and popular music, and in particularly Hindi film songs. And then the 3rd section looks at the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War as a crucial moment in history and its aftermath, and focusing on what I call dramatic radio, which includes radio drama, but also enacting of letters written to radio stations. And now to the main arguments, sort of the overlapping argument that sort of the book brings together is that despite the British, Indian, and Pakistani politicians' repeated and consistent efforts to usurp the medium for state purposes, the medium of radio in South Asia effectively contested the cultural, linguistic, and political agendas of the British colonial administration and the later independent Indian and Pakistani governments. And that is sort of the overall argument that brings the sections together. But there's a number of important sub-arguments, and I just want to mention a few that I think are relevant to our conversation. In conversation with the works on sound studies, I developed the concept of radio resonance, and that's to analyze how conversation, rumor, and gossip could intensify, expand, and enrich radio broadcasts. This is extremely important in the beginning during World War II, when a very limited section of the population would have had access to actual radio receivers to have heard. But sources showed me that despite the lack of radio receivers, the influence of radio remained really important because people talked about radio programs. But the idea of radio as being talked and talking as a form of listening is one that takes place throughout the book, even in the sections dealing with when we already have transistors that make radio widely available in South Asia past the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Radio programs' influence, I argue, extended beyond the reach of receivers because radio was not only listened to, but also talked about, and that conversation was not supplementary, but central to the medium's reception. And thinking about how talking can be a form of listening, I think is really a ways which has resonance too with Akshya's way of thinking about the ways in which we can think about language as seen rather than just read, or think about how language is heard and spoken rather than read within literature studies. And I would say a 3rd argument that I want to sort of present here is one of chronology. So a guiding conviction of the book has been that the study of media forms, and in particular sound media, is fundamental to the study of history. So just that radio history is history, which is actually remarkably hard to do. But what I want to show is that attention to sound sources, and particularly attention to radio, actually forces us to rethink the standard periodization of the region's history. So even on the most basic level, a history of radio cannot be a history that ends at 1947 or that looks only at the colonial period or only at the post-independence period. Radio begins, really grows during World War II, and remains pivotally important until the 80s. So you're forced to look at that period together. And the second one is thinking about moments that are important in history. Historians have argued, of course, that 1947 independence and 1971, which are the nation-making events, are watershed events. A radio of history forces us to see it quite differently. It points to World War II rather than independence itself, rather than as a crucial moment. And it looks at the 1965 war as another crucial moment that did not lead to nation-making, but that was particularly important to thinking about how languages and medium of radio participated in that time period. And now to the idea of postcolonial studies here. So I want to begin with the notion that I did not envision the book as one that was making an intervention in postcolonial studies. On the contrary, I envisioned the book as one that moved away from the main arguments of postcolonial studies, period. The section of the book that focuses particularly in the decade after independence used to be called Music in the Postcolonial, in Postcolonial India and Pakistan. And I changed that section quite consciously to post-independence because I saw the book as moving away from post-colonial studies. And the reason why I saw the book as moving away from post-colonial studies is because I envisioned that to understand what radio did, I had to think about the colonial moment and the post-colonial moment together, and that there was no other way to possibly do that. But also because I didn't want to think of Hindi and Urdu as languages that were separate from colonialism, from the colonial moment. And I didn't necessarily want to think of Hindi and Urdu as recovering indigeneity in any way. And in fact, the vast majority of the listeners that I write about were listeners that would have never considered themselves as native speakers of Hindi and Urdu. I was thinking of Hindi and Urdu as a language that in many ways, I wouldn't say a lingua franca, but that was non-indigenous. And I felt that postcolonial studies in history in particularly had emphasized a kind of recovery of language, a kind of recovery of finding that. And I wanted to move fully away from that. And then the other reason why I didn't necessarily think of myself as postcolonial studies is really because of the arguments that Daniel makes in his book, which is the idea of a world without colonialism, which I felt that post-colonial scholars were searching for. The idea that scholars can do that, to me, didn't necessarily make sense in the history that I was studying. And for me, I felt that that's not only an impossibility, but in many ways that might not be necessarily what's the best thing, period. in understanding that time period. So for that reason, I saw the book as moving away from that. That said, I do, in conversation with Akshya and Daniel, I do realize that the book is very much still drawing on much of the really important work that postcolonial studies did. And I just wanted to mention a few that are important. So thinking about radio resonance and the notion to think about radio resonance, I had to think about the power and importance of rumor. Because during World War II, radio broadcasts became really important because they helped spread rumors about events during World War II. And what allowed me to think about the importance of rumor was a lot of the scholarship that's self-identified as postcolonial studies in history that thought about the importance of rumor in that time period. The other part, I think, where actually, I think I could end it at that, and then we'll continue when we go into the discussions of the further books.
Okay, thanks everybody. This was great, and I'm still processing some of it, but I want to get us started on thinking about certain concepts as they emerge from your presentations, respective presentations, and how these concepts may then relate to our kind of this collective discussion on postcolonial method. And something that stood out to me was how all of you engaged with the idea of a world in different but also comparative ways. So Akshya, of course, you talk about English. I think I read your book as a study of worlding English, right? That we're not just reading English as this kind of dissociated space, yes, a medium, but also how it is lived in everyday world. So there's almost a conceptualization of the everyday, of the lived reality of English. And then, of course, Danielle, I liked how you're kind of talking about the work of postcolonial studies in relation to imagining another world. I do take a little bit of an issue with, or I would actually want to invite you to think more about the differences between anti-colonialism and postcolonial studies in relation to what you conceive of this idea of theory. What is theory, and what is the work of theory? I, for my part, read theory in its historical moment, that what are the questions of the moment that theory responds to, and whether it just imagines another world, or does it speak to its own world. And that, I think, and especially theory as an institutionalized sort of form, theory within academia. So how are you kind of engaging with this idea of theory, and what and the way it makes or envisions or responds to different kinds of worlds? And then Isabel, in the same vein, I'm thinking about the mediated worlds that you're kind of talking about, and especially that idea about how radio history allows us to question our understandings of our regular understandings of periodizing history, right? That you're kind of imagining a transnational world that exists within media, and where people are kind of still talking, and despite the crisis of the time. So I just wanted to invite you all to think about or to speak more about ideas of worlding. And here I'm, of course, sort of taking from Feng Chia's idea of what constitutes a world in your different projects, but also the relationship between worlding and theory, and how does postcolonial theory do the work of worlding, if it is, and whether this world is historical to begin with. And that's a question for Daniel, really. Yeah.
Guess that it's a hazard answer. I mean, so I think you're absolutely correct. I think I was relying quite heavily implicitly on the should of a prompt. I want postcolonial studies to be roughly synonymous with the imagination of anti-colonial thought, but you're absolutely correct. In fact, one of the kind of tragedies perhaps that we can identify in postcolonial studies is that so if anti-colonial thought emerges from guerrilla movements in the mountains of Algeria, or the back alleys of Calcutta, or all of these kind of places that we not associate with institutional force. The very true thing about postcolonial theory and postcolonial studies is that it emerges in a very particular set of places in North America in the 70s and 80s, and as you kind of really brilliantly described it in the opening statement. So in other words, it is never not been an institutional force. It is never, postcolonial theory carries with it, historically speaking, the force of the North American Academy. I mean, almost provincially, Chicago and and Cambridge, but I think, as we, I mean, in some ways, what Isabel was pointing towards, right, as we kind of take stock of the limitations of that, and its location within the institution, I mean, I want to kind of point out the promissory note that has been mishandled, right, and to reclaim a kind of both genealogy and synonymousness, wherein the method of postcolonial studies, the method of postcolonial theory, departs in some ways from its institutional location, and acts on behalf of the imagination which it was granted by virtue of its lineage. I mean, in some ways, that is most easily found in just simply the kind of way that Fanon has been taken up. So the kind of readings of Fanon from Sud to Hannah Arendt to the kind of early postcolonial theories encounter with Fanon by way of Lacan, all of these moments failed to notice, it seems to me, Fanon's insistence that the postcolonial world would not exists beyond an abyss, right? And so it's only recently that David Marriott has a beautiful book, Wither Fanon, where he really points out the importance of the abyss that exists between our world and the world that Fanon wants and advocates for. So to kind of assert as the central issue a project of impossibility, and also Fanon's quite dismal diagnosis that the colonial world, if the colonial world is Manichaean, when it ends in a world of blocks, where the third world has to choose between the first and the second world for allegiance. And so the Manichaean world lives on quite strongly after the Manichaean world. Colonialism lives quite strongly after colonialism. So yes, so you're absolutely, so I think my goal in some ways, this is also intended to like Aniket Roy, is to think about what it would mean to deinstitutionalize or destitutionalize the project of postcolonial theory, to align it with its benefactor.
I can jump in next. Thank you for that set of questions. I think what constitutes a world is obviously both, like at some deeply, profoundly political level, a question that animates the book, but also in really crass terms, this book was, like I was writing this book at a time when conversations around world literature, as Daniel's book engages with them as well, but conversations around world literature and the global Anglophone were really like blowing up, frankly. And I think there was an understanding that the scale of literary studies, the future of literary studies always has to be big, always has to be global and transnational. And there are effective ways to do it, as Daniel shows it, but then there are also not that many effective ways to do it, as other books have shown us. So part of what I wanted to do was to really, I think that moment of sort of, the moment that kept coming back to me as I was writing the book, of being the student of postcolonial studies in an Indian classroom, and you know, constantly talking about English as this language of colonialism, which it of course is, but at the same time it was doing so much more. So I think part of what you call worlding English was really also a response to the discipline and to the institutionalized force of North American, you know, postcolonial studies, as Daniel points out, was to really bring the text back into the world. That, like, it sounds also empirical in a way that sometimes I would balk at it, but it was really an attempt to bring things back to the ground. Like, this is what you're talking about. Like, there were, you know, like that when we talk about English, we're obviously talking about the British Empire, but we're not only talking about the British Empire. Like, English lives in other ways in the world, and we need to acknowledge it. Part of it was also kind of in the spirit of what Daniel said, like this desire to imagine, or as Stuart Hall says, like restage the encounter between the colonizer and the colonized. So it was an act of imagination, but it was an act of imagination, which I suppose, as Daniel writes in his book, was this politics of impatience, or an activism of impatience, where I'm like, this story, like we need new stories about English. And so it was also an attempt to reconstitute the world in that sense. And finally, I think this is where sort of I appreciate Isabel's work so much. It was really a desire to deal with the materiality of the world. As literary scholars and postcolonial studies as a field, I think it's so easy to be divorced by, like, we talk so much about book history, but at the same time, like, that's a very small subfield, and it's so easy to be divorced from, you know, how language circulates, for instance, or thinking about the materiality of media forms, or how even an English language book, for instance, a novel in India circulates in the world, you know, it circulates in India. So it was a desire to like wed theory with just like the archives that it's supposed to be speaking in the name of. So it was a desire to sort of bring those things together. And in that spirit, something that I perhaps didn't emphasize in my fairly longish talk was, I think there's an institutionalized force of postcolonial studies in the North American Academy, but at the same time, South Asia remains this paradigmatic site. And even that understanding of South Asia is deeply, deeply caste marked by class privileges in a way that none of us, I think, because we are all complicit, but also implicated, talk about. So the desire to talk about this other English was also a desire to just begin to sort of name what the institutional force of the North American Academy is in some ways. And that was another way of worlding it, to bring it back to the question.
Well, I think it has been covering. It has been covered. To me, so many different wording was really about, and it's not a term that I use, but a term that I think that I could have, was really about moving away from a history that makes the state the point of departure, and that looks at other forms of connections that existed and that were very important at the time period, and that had a life of their own. And that came from a actually rather personal perspective. So when I wrote a proposal for the dissertation, I said I'm going to work on All India Radio and Radio Pakistan, and the response immediately was like, "That's too much for a dissertation. You cannot do that. You have to select one of them. You really can get into a lot of problems." And to me, it just did not make sense to do it any other way, because I grew up in between worlds. I grew up in the US-Mexico border, and if you wanted to understand that particular, that was the world to me. In between was the world. So I sort of, that's what interested me. So word for me was a way to move away from that. I think wordling can be think about a way of thinking of alternative geographies that people create and why those alternative geographies are important. I also felt that post-colonial studies in its, and again, I don't want to say all post-colonial studies. I think Akshya's point is really good. South Asian studies and post-colonial studies within South Asian studies, in a very legitimate effort to criticize the empire, to criticize British Empire, to criticize colonialism, also created a number of blind spots, and created a number of blind spots that didn't allow us to sort of engage with what was going, what mattered to people at the time period. So wordling to me, or finding that, was to sort of think about those spots and how people thought about that, right? And I felt that in criticizing the colonial empire, in criticizing the British colonial state, the British government of India, particularly historians, often gave more power to the state that it actually had, power that it didn't really have over people's everyday lives. And I wanted to recover that, because I also felt it, and it was easy for me to see it because I felt it in my own life. The border that I grew up was simultaneously rigid and governed all my life. I spent all my time, and at the same time, it was porous in the ways that people figure out ways to live with it and beyond it. And I wanted to sort of center that. And I think that's where that was the world that I was interested in.
I really love that formulation of alternative geographies, right? And porous borders. And Akshya, I like how you talked about, and I hope later we can kind of talk more about this conjunction between post-colonial studies, area studies, and comparative studies. But I wanted to just have, I had a little follow-up to some of your, some of your remarks. And I'm thinking about whether the world of post-colonial studies, or at least the way it sort of emerges within the concerns of your book, is also gendered. And so, for example, when I think of English, one of my really favorite films to show students is English Winglish. You know, we're kind of thinking about gender and about modernity in relation to language. And I think of this concern very much simultaneous to the concern around caste. Right, that what is English enabling people to do, and of course, and so I just wonder, how, and of course, Daniel, your book, I'm looking at these anti-colonial thinkers, and I really like the ideas that it's putting up, but I'm also wondering, where are the women, right? And what about, and whether anti-colonial thought, and as I call it in my intro, ways of address, the ways of address of anti-colonial thoughts in some way, if we were to only read these male thinkers, appears as somewhat masculinist, and the way, so what kind of ideas are then imagined within a particular, if we kind of don't think of this world as gendered. So I just wanted to push you all to think more through the rubric of gender, to kind of refract some of the conversations in your book, and kind of and bring it to bear on conversations around gender and post-colonial studies.
I can go first, but I would, oh, sorry, Isabel, were you going to say something? Okay, I'll start by saying that this is a question I'm very invested in answering, but I'm also eager to hear from Daniel and Isabel, because as I was reading their books, I had the same sense, like, right, we're all like so deeply cognizant of the fact that we're only talking about men, but there's also, but at the same time, we continue to do that. So I wanted to hear more from others too. But to your point, I think there's a way in which I wish I could talk about gender as we understand it. I wish we could talk about, you know, women writers, for instance, or I wish I could just talk about more women, or, you know, like there's this understanding of what gender studies does that I wish I could have done more. But at the same time, I will say that the concern with gender is actually palpable and running throughout the book, right? Like starting with Modi, for instance, and the kind of sort of Hindu masculinity he puts forward, or thinking about how English is often pitted against this very gendered and feminized idea of the mother tongue, which, as Isabel points out, are often sort of, you know, used to refer to like other Indian languages that have no actually, you know, like claim to natality or indigeneity or anything. So, and that comes up in chapter 4, where I'm talking about women in Manipur using the English language to protest the state, especially protest sort of sexual violences of the state. So there's a way in which I wish I could draw out more about how English relates to Dalit masculinity, for instance. And I think that's a piece of the puzzle that I really do continue to think about and want to write about. But just in as much as caste is always unmarked in South Asian studies as upper caste, I think there's a way in which the unmarkedness of gender is drawing attention to precisely the often sort of masculinist understanding of language and understanding of sort of like modernity that enables, or at least entices, so many figures who want to engage with English.
Does anyone else want
Yes, sure. I'm happy to answer. I think this is a fundamental question, and one that I have found the philosopher and theorist Adriana Cavarero particularly helpful and made me thinking about this through sound studies. Adriana Cavarero makes the argument that in so many instances, women's voices are about corporality. So women's voices can be heard as bodies and therefore about corporality, while men's voices can be about intellectuality and thought, and how that's crucial to the understanding of the human voice as being unique. So all of us have a unique voice, just in the same way that we have a unique imprint. There is not another person in this world that would sound just like me, regardless of what language I'm speaking. And she says that in the understanding of that, women's corporality becomes really important. That becomes really crucial to understanding several moments, but in particular the 1965 war moment and the role of the playback singer Noor Jahan. And what she does in that ultra-nationalist Pakistani moment, when you have a defining of the Pakistani nation against what is perceived as an aggression from India. And Noor Jahan actually performs on the radio extemporaneously, or as it's claimed, a number of songs that still circulate. And in the production of that, her voice becomes her body, right? While the rest of the men who are important in the radio station are intellectuality to it. Interestingly, the response to that, which is such a big response, is the AIR Urdu service, which is inaugurated in India after 1965. And that AIR service was meant to be only for Pakistani listeners, but becomes very popular in India as well. And Noor Jahan also plays a crucial role in it. So even in an imagining, and the AIR Urdu service imagines a alternative geography in which it sees West Pakistan and India and North India as a place to remember a lost past. And in remembering that, the image of Noor Jahan and the center of that, and the corporality of her voice and the association to her voice also becomes a center for it. And I found that really important to understanding what takes place and why is it that the 1965 war is so important. But I also found it very important to understanding earlier moments, which, as Akshya points out, are marked as dominant. And when they're marked as dominant, they're marked as male. Right? And to thinking through what that meant at that time period. And it helped me understand sort of another hyper-nationalist moment, 1950s, and the 1950s and the establishing of All India Radio as the voice of the nation and the ways in which that was gendered as well.
Yeah,
I
thank
hope
you
that
so much.
answers your question.
Sorry, I missed that.
I hope that answers your question.
Oh yes, absolutely. It's really great. And also, I mean, this is a concern that's important for me as I'm thinking about the cultural history of the emergency. I think that a lot of the texts I'm looking at squarely look at gender or kind of imagine the emergency as a gendered event. But most of the writers and most of the people and the texts are by men. And so I'm kind of thinking about the intellectual political history of this event through this kind of where gender is always there, and yet everyone who's speaking or recording are primarily men. So this is a concern that's really, and so thank you for helping me also to think about it. And Isabel, your last point really brings me to my next question, and that is about language. I really liked how you talked about, thinking about thinking about women's language as visceral in a way. I'm a little uncomfortable with it, but I also want to sit with it and work with it, which is that, women's language is visceral versus sort of, the intellectual and the visceral, and this kind of dichotomy in how we think about voice and women's voices. And I think that Akshya, your book does that a lot, which kind of imagines language in these different ways, that language not just as spoken, as read, but also as lived. So the affective dimensions of language, I think, are really important. And so when I think of your, Isabel, what you're saying alongside Akshya's work too, it begins to kind of make sense to me about how all of you are sort of adapting this very expansive idea of voice, of language. And I also think that this kind of idea is facilitated by your engagements with media, right? Because you're always thinking of language as mediated, as language which is spoken, heard, lived viscerally in a way, right? It makes possible intellectual histories, but it's also kind of makes possible lived histories. And so I just wanted to invite you all to sort of speak a little more about this idea about language, because Daniel, I'm reading your book and I'm interested in this idea of reading, right? And I wonder if you also think about reading beyond reading the actual text, but at a more philosophical level. What could reading mean as a way of connection? Reading as mediation, as if it were, and then again, of course, Isabel speaking and reading letters out to each other, to kind of dramatizing reading in a way, because when I think of letters, I've often somehow thought of letters when it's so obvious, right, that in radio people are reading out letters or kind of sort of speaking to each other, but so that there's a kind of dramatization of reading in a way. So I just wanted you to kind of maybe engage a little with your formulations of language, and how your engagements with media changes that, and how then do we think about the language of postcolonial studies? Because as we kind of continue to think of the method of postcolonial studies, what is the language of this sort of this methodological intervention?
I feel like I want to start way back in your questions, because I think that for me they're all sort of jumbled together. They're all and I'm indebted to Pratma Banerjee for pointing this out. I mean, what my book turns out to have done, and in a way that I did not realize it as I was writing it, it had to be kind of told to me, was it stalls. It's kind of stubbornly takes a nationalist project and refuses its nationalism. It takes a masculinist project and refuses its masculinism, and takes a kind of elite project of literary acquisition, literary critical acquisition, and installs that. So in other words, what and it uses the interwar period as the alibi for stalling 1947 as the teleological realization of independence. So in other words, the book is a study of nationalist masculinist experts that from page 2 says they are not nationalists, they are not masculinists, and they are not they're not experts. On one hand, it's just simply that I'm stubborn and have a mulish personality, but the other, I think, is that it seems to me to be central to the post-colonial kind of historiography of South Asia, that these are the founding fathers, that these are the experts, Gandhi and Ambedkar and so on, that it seems absolutely necessary to go see how they themselves, at least in my reading, were theorizing everything but their own mastery, everything but their own masculinity, and especially especially in the 1950s, as Isabel points out, but also in Modi's India, right? The masculinist recuperation of Gandhi, the masculinist recuperation of Ambedkar, I mean, is really, I mean, it is really disconcerting. And so the impetus to go to, the impetus to have a book of only men was actually to foreground the things that we lose when we look at masculinity in a narrowly defined way, and to go back to these thinkers as thinkers who thought of political action beyond the masculinely recognizable set of politics that we now ascribe to them. That's also true. I mean, you know, I was going to kind of fake argument with Isabel around nationalism, the formation of Urdu being Pakistani in some way, and Hindi being India. But I mean, as I was trying to fake that argument, I was realizing that I am someone who is very hesitant to bring the state in, to let the state in to my own argument. I want to kind of have that question be bracketed off for 1 minute, so that we can imagine a world where the nation will come back in. It will be all of the things that it does forcefully, it does imperially. That will happen, but I think in line with the thinkers that I studied, Gandhi and Ambedkar, Bhagat Singh, Fanon, Auerbach in some ways, the goal was not simply to sort of think non-teleologically, but actually to bracket for 1 second the possibility, the kind of the limitations that the nation immediately puts in. And that has everything to do, so on one hand, that has everything to do with colonialism. On the other, and for Auerbach, right, nationalism was, there's two things happening with nationalism in Auerbach's time. One is that the founding kind of impetus of world literature is Goethe receives credit for it, right? And it has very much to do with an imagination of a unified Germany. And so German nationalism is actually, you know, sort of co-created with the concept of Weltliteratur, which is when Goethe reads a certain Chinese novelist or something and imagines that they have something in common, but also very different people anyway. So in Auerbach's moment, which is the rise of Nazism in the 1920s, 30s, another movement to unify Germany is underway. So in the first instance, Goethe's nationalism was Germany over Deutschland über alles, I mean Germany over all of our differences. The horrific realization of that in the 1920s and 30s was Deutschland über alles, Germany over the world, Germany over everything, right? And so world literature, it seems to me, is also very much caught up with a question, and Auerbach was very kind of intimately aware of this, caught up with the question of nationalism. This is where we talk about national literatures in the departments of French and Spanish and so on. And it seemed necessary also to solve the question of nationalism as it related to literary analysis as well. And to take the figure of the founding father of comparative literature, and his masterful book Mimesis, to think of them as projects that were theorizing their own and expertise, their own kind of ambivalence about mastery. And so in other words, in their own ambivalence about a certain form of masculinity that is synonymous, that is sort of somehow rendered synonymous with mastery, that I think is really, really is really nefarious. So that would be, so that would be the first half of that. I guess I'm thinking something like Srimati Ramaswamy on who also Ushi Patel, the other women theorists of South Asia who have shown how the nation is not simply kind of given to women, but actually forced upon their bodies, right? So Nur Jahan seems to me to be actually a moment where the nation takes on, doesn't simply take on gender, but is actually forced upon women in order to play the role of the nation. So the other option would be Mother India as the film, which puts all of the burden of India on one woman, right? And Noor Jahan seems like it would be another moment of this. And similarly, I mean, I was trying to look for it. It's somewhere in the deep archive of my computer. During the Indian emergency, there's this phenomenally weird picture of Indira Gandhi emerging from the top half of India. So the bottom sort of triangle looks like India, and then suddenly it's Indira Gandhi's head. And so this kind of forceful placement of the nation on it's not kind of given to women. It seems to me to be forced upon women's bodies as the site where the nation takes one of its its inaugural violence, and then proceeds to do additional violences from there on. So I think, yeah, I'm both excited about this project of thinking about the corporality of men's voice, especially Cavero is a really phenomenal thinker, but I also worry that in the context of South Asia, especially, and in the wake of partition, women's bodies have been actually, women's voices have been lost at the site actually of the really kind of the precarious corporality, and that has a tradition of its own.
Yeah.
Should we?
Sorry, I wasn't sure if this was a cue for me to jump in or a good point for us to invite comments from the audience.
Both.
Yeah, I just really, I somehow I kind of lost track of time a little bit. But yes, I mean, we could probably open the floor for discussion and invite the audience in, and then we could kind of respond and bring some of these concerns in again. Yeah, so questions, comments.
Is there a way we can see people when they ask questions? Or
So
no?
the thing that we tend to do in these events is invite people to raise their hand and then have the option of turning on their camera and speaking into the mic. But the other option would be, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, completely fine. You can type your question in the chat and we'll read it as it comes up. So please jump in. Feel free to.
And as we're waiting, maybe Akshya and Isabel, if you want to.
Yeah.
If you want to.
Akshya, I have a comment that you might enjoy. Recently, I was thinking about it. So I booked a place here at the where I'm staying at Delhi, which is the India Islamic Cultural Center. And I called on the phone, and she answered in English, "Hi." So I answered in my English, in my English, and her response was, "I don't understand your language." So I felt a dagger in my heart as a non-native speaker, but she didn't mean it in the least offensive way at all. So then I switched to Hindi, and it worked really well, but she didn't mean it in the least offensive way. She just couldn't understand my accent on the phone, my American-Spanish accented one. But I thought it was a lovely position of Indian English as a language. She didn't understand my language, the one I was speaking at that moment. And the moment we switched, it was fine, right? But it felt like a dagger, and then I had to think about it through it, and then it no longer felt like a dagger, right? She wasn't criticizing my Spanish accent, she just couldn't understand it.
I like that story. I don't appreciate the fact that even for a second you felt offended, or that she said something like, "I don't understand your language." It seems offensive no matter how you say it.
Yes.
But I think there's something interesting
She didn't mean
there.
it in that way. She's lovely, I think so.
I'm glad that's how it worked. But I think it does, you're right, like just the accented nature of English, which is being spoken by you in this case, like really renders Indian English its own sort of universe, its own world and language. And part of what I'm trying to do is sort of take it seriously as that, right? Like, is there a way in which we can think about English in India today, which of course acknowledges why it continues to be prevalent, but then at the same time thinks about how it might, intersect with other kinds of identities on the ground. I actually wanted to just pick up on some things that Daniel said at the end. I really appreciate it. And I think in some ways we might be like aligned on that. And it gives me language to describe what I'm doing. When you say that you're taking these figures who are, like working within nationalist sort of frameworks, or who are nationalist and masculinist, and then refusing that nationalism and masculinity as sort of the framework to read them. And I think in some ways I'm trying to do that for English. There's a way in which English is all of these global colonial things, but at the same time, like, hold off, like there's another way to do this, right? So I really like that language of refusal. And this is a question that's often posed to me, so I'm posing it to you so that you can further help me answer it. But like in the case of someone like Ambedkar, and I taught your chapter on annihilation of caste, and I was sort of thinking about Ambedkar's performance of mastery, right? The way he talks about Hindu Shastras, the way he talks about discipline, like scientific sort of disciplines that you talk about in your chapter. And there is that claim to mastery, that performance of mastery is integral to the argument, the way I see it. And so I sometimes wonder, like, what is the politics of our refusal, right? Like, what do we, like, yes, we're reading these figures outside of their frameworks. Yes, we're drawing attention to sort of the uncertain ways in which they're claiming knowledge, but at the same time, the performance of mastery is part of what they're doing, and to not take that seriously seems, I don't know how to make sense of it.
You're absolutely right. I think one of the, in some ways, this is something that Ajay Skaya has. This is his critique of the book as well, which is that putting Gandhi and Ambedkar and Bhagat Singh and Lala Hardayal, leaving aside Bhagat Singh and Lala Hardayal, putting Ambedkar and Gandhi on the same, effectively creating a grounds for equivalence between those two thinkers is doing some level of significant harm. One is because Gandhi had the privilege to relinquish his privilege, and Ambedkar did not have the privilege to be able to relinquish his privilege. And and so much was at stake for Ambedkar to assert a form of mastery. I think so. This is what I think. So the book is sort of it claims to be about readers, but there's not any readers to be found. I think Ambedkar is thinking about a mode of reading practice which is at least gestures towards a kind of egalitarian critique. So he's not trying to. I do not think that Ambedkar is trying to disavow his mastery or relinquish his mastery. There was too much at stake for him to attempt that. There were plenty of people really excited to relinquish his mastery on behalf of him, and there was this constant life battle. But I do think that what Ambedkar is doing is thinking about a different way of distributing mastery as collective critique. So in other words, it was really helpful when to think. When I'm thinking about readers, and when I think that Ambedkar's thinking about readers, when I think Gandhi's thinking about readers, they're not doing, as Preeti said, they're not doing much reading. Actually, they're mostly doing a lot of talking about reading, just as what one does with the radio. One listens to it, but one spends more time talking about having listened to it. And so that kind of on one hand, I guess it would be kind of the senses. You could say that these are the senses, perhaps. The senses of listening, of hearing, of speaking, of touch, the kind of corporality of English in South Asia. But it's also, for me, it's about associability, right? It's an openness towards others in the world that marks. So listening to the radio in order to talk about the radio, reading in order to talk about reading with friends, it seems to me to mark the kind of egalitarian practice that's actually at the heart of that aspiration.
Can I jump in on that? Yeah, I think about mastery often, but I think about mastery from a different context, and I think about my role as a scholar of South Asia. And I wrote a little bit about this, or I didn't. We did, me and my co-writer Khoda Bande Hamidi, about what it means, like who a South Asian is, and what does mastery mean in that context. And I think in many ways, I now see how that's influenced, Daniel, by your particular book. And I think that there is an unmarked form of mastery that is assumed by certain people, and that and I think that there is that unmarked form of mastery that is assumed by some people is often ones that how that mastery is actually accomplished is not explained. It sort of goes unexplained, right? So I thought that what Daniel's book also in some ways was doing is forcing us to read the ways in which anti-colonial readers were aware, anti-colonial thinkers were aware of their necessity of presenting themselves as having masteries of things and what that meant. And that reading of it, I think, is crucial to postcolonial studies, right? That thinking about how is it that mastery is achieved? How is it that mastery is assumed? Is sort of crucial to what postcolonial studies is trying to do. I don't know if that helps, right? But I think that it goes even beyond our sources to how we think about our role as scholars as well. Because I'm never going to have mastery of Hindi Urdu broadcasting ever, not even close to it. I will never be able to actually have a single sentence that is completely unaccented, whatever that would mean, right? Which is impossible. So what does that mean in that context? I think is really, it means recognizing why is it that mastery is assumed.
And I just want to jump in there, Isabel. That's such a great observation, because I'm thinking here that you're kind of, in a way, your statement critiques this relationship between mastery and authenticity, right? Or something like a presumed authenticity based on one's origins, within quotes, right? Because and then that and what does that have to say with how we kind of think about area studies in general? So I'm thinking two things. First, the place of authenticity in a kind of in thinking or conceptualizing mastery, and then that also then takes me to the question of the vernacular, as the vernacular is often seen, or the indigenous is often seen as a place of authenticity rather than as a site for relationality. And that itself, what you're saying is that's a problem, right? That we never have that kind of mastery based on authenticity, but also there is no authenticity of that kind, right? There's nothing that's truly authentic in what constitutes a particular area studies scholar or the right kind of postcolonial studies scholar. So I just wanted to throw in this comment there, but also just as an invitation for us to think about the relationship between postcolonial studies, comparative studies, and area studies. Because I think that at least as someone recently on the market, I'm often called upon to kind of comment on that, right? That when I'm speaking about when I'm marketing myself as a postcolonial studies scholars, people would often say, but you only work on South Asia. I remember once being asked a question that, your work is so by an American studies scholar, that you only work on South Asia, and so what about, the global, what about this kind of transnational, that aspect, but also, so the current, this idea of provinciality sort of associated with area studies and then authenticity. So just some, these, I think these are kind of rambling thoughts that I just threw out and that came up as I heard Isabel's comments, and would love to hear what others have to say.
Can I tack on something just really quickly, because which is, I mean, in the context of the North American Academy, the other book that Akshya has recently published is that we haven't talked about is Thinking with an Accent, which she co-edited with a few people. But I actually think that I wonder if the reverse is also true, that the act of thinking with an accent in the North American Academy, like that is a kind of ambivalent or unstable position rather than one that can be automatically associated with mastery or something else. I was just curious to hear your thoughts, Akshya.
Thanks. I think I'm so glad for this last cluster of thoughts, I'll say, and thanks for dropping the link to Thinking with an Accent, which is open access. And I think my colleague Ragini Therur Srinivasan's essay particularly is talking about being a post-colonial scholar and being interpolated as a South Asianist and all of that. But to our conversation right now, I quickly wanted to say that I'm so glad that this is where we are sort of ending, which is because the second part of my question for Daniel was that in this context of this politics of refusal, what is sort of the role of the critic in the post-colonial method? And I think Isabel's then attention to mastery, or this desire to relinquish mastery, or to at least call into question how certain brown bodies are supposed to be more knowledgeable about South Asia versus certain others, or how those who work in certain languages are supposed to be more knowledgeable about South Asia is called into question, or at least I think the question of mediation of scholarly knowledge is important. Like, how do we know what we know and who's telling us and why that particular information is deemed more important? I was thinking specifically about even just the term South Asia, which we all claim to work, but I actually really only work on India. I don't work on South. Like there's a way where it's like the metonymy just keeps sort of like exponentially increasing. Like I'm a scholar of post-colonial India, a very small sort of fraction of even Indian history, but then I'm standing in to speak for all of South Asia and all of global South. And I think in some ways was the method of post-colonial studies should be a method of humility, to recognize that, like to call into question how we are deemed masterful, why mastery is important, thinking back to Daniel's book, but also at the same time trying to think about, I think, that idea of unknowing that's so important in Daniel's book, and the idea of like listening without really paying attention, and like that idea of unknowing seems to me very important. And something that I'm trying to do in the book is to not only think of the post-colonial Anglophone sort of scholar as a speaker of English, but to think about other ways of speaking in English that are deemed as, I'm borrowing from Daniel a lot today, but like what Daniel calls a dustbin of acts, so that are improperly political. There are ways in which acts that are improperly masterful are not taken seriously. And part of what I think we're all trying to do is engage with those acts and call them into question, to somewhat challenge our own presumed mastery as post-colonial scholars.
I think we might be towards the end of our conversation, so I want to just pass the mic to Daniel unless anyone has more comments, and then maybe you could. Yes, Isabel.
So we can conclude that post-colonial studies should not be about mastery. Right? It's not about, that's one thing that we came to a conclusion.
Yeah.
Sorry, Daniel.
Yeah, and we could, yeah, that's great. Mm-hmm.
I hate to follow up. That was perfect, but I just want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you to the panelists for having this conversation, for humoring me. Thank you to Georgina for arranging all of the details. Thank you for coming, and thank you for staying for the conversation. I will end on an unmasterful note in the spirit of